Hi, my name is Will, and I have read a lot of comics. I have followed comic characters for decades and watched them pass from writer to writer and artist to artist, each creative team adding new elements to a character's story and evolving them in new directions. This process fascinates me, and looking at these changes is how I like to engage with comics. I'm going to look at the DC Comics character Martian Manhunter, who has been around for over 70 years, so he has a lot of history and has undergone many changes. He's appeared in comics, movies, television, and video games. He has two big claims to fame. The first is his association with the Justice League of America. He's a founding member, and he shows up in many incarnations of the League. His other notable feature is his vast list of powers. He can do a lot of stuff, and is usually considered one of the more powerful DC characters, partially because of this vast array of abilities. This character has a long and rich history, and my intent is to try and go deeper on the character than you might find elsewhere. To do so, I'm going to make multiple videos. This first one will be about his origin in Detective Comics 225 in the year 1955, and his time as a detective where he had no public superhero identity and acts as a police officer with secret powers. This lasts until Detective Comics 273 in 1959. In issue 273, his ability to operate in secret is greatly hampered, so he is forced to become a public superhero. So it makes sense as a rough cutoff point when talking about the character. Some things I will talk about will cover some stuff outside this period, and I will skip some subjects and talk about them in later videos, so that cutoff won't be very strict. But before I talk more about this character, I want to give a little context in terms of what was called the Silver Age of comics. Wikipedia says the Silver Age was from 1956 to 1970. The comics of the time shared a lot of elements. This was driven by a few things. The first was censorship. In 1953, the United States Senate had hearings about the contents of comics because they were concerned about the corrupting influence of comics on youth. I expect these would have been like the rock and roll hearings in 1985, or the video game hearings in 1993, or maybe the television violence hearings in 1999, or perhaps even the social media hearings in 2024. If only the youth weren't so easy to corrupt. Anyway, the outcome of these hearings was a private regulation system put in place in 1954 to take the steam out of calls for government regulation, much like how we have the Motion Picture Association that rates films. The way it worked was that comics would be submitted to the association, and if approved, they could carry a stamp. It was pretty important to have this stamp because many retailers would not carry comics that didn't have the stamp. The original rules were fairly draconian and often oddly specific. Nothing to cast authority like police or the government in a bad light. Nothing could be included that could provide sympathy for criminals. Evil could never be attractive, and criminals could never be glamorous. Good always had to triumph over evil. No sex or nudity, and females should be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. No profanity, which is actually one of the rules that lasted quite a while. And now we get kind of oddly specific. No vampires, zombies, or werewolves. No comics with horror or terror in the title. So you can see how these rules would have quite a large impact on the characters and stories presented in comics. Specifically, it wiped out the horror genre of comics. Horror comics were largely replaced with superhero comics that fit better in these guidelines. Another important piece of context is the consumption patterns. Modern comics are known for having long stories that stretch across many issues, but in the Silver Age, every story in a comic had to be contained within that comic, no multi-part stories. Part of this may have been due to the fact that the target audience was younger than today. It was very much literature for kids, and creators may have felt that kids lacked the attention span for longer stories or the buying power to buy a series of comics. Kids might also only have access to comics at places like barbershops or doctor's offices. The other big influence during this period was the increasing popularity of science fiction. Science fiction anthologies were popular during this time, and there was a lot of cross-pollinations of ideas between comic authors and science fiction writers. Advancements in technologies and the beginnings of the space race helped fuel this interest. In superhero comics, many old characters who were no longer appearing in comics were brought back and given new science fiction themed origins. A new Green Lantern gets his powers from a ring created by aliens instead of a magic rock. The new Hawkman is an alien instead of an archaeologist, and so on. Okay, so now that we have some historical context, let's look at how Martian Manhunter starts. He first appears in Detective Comics 225. Detective Comics at this time is an anthology book with around 3 different stories by different writers and artists. The book was headlined by Batman. You might have heard of him. He's kind of a detective. The other stories were about normal human detectives like Roy Raymond and Captain Compass, and were roughly 6 pages long. Captain Compass was a nautical detective whose stories were written by Otto Binder and drawn by Joe Certa. Now, Otto Binder was a pretty busy guy, having recently launched the comic Superman's Pal Jimmy Olsen. Yes, Jimmy Olsen had his own comic. Anyway, the Captain Compass feature ended at Detective Comics 224 and it needed to be replaced. So DC, which was National Comics at the time, got Joseph Semixon, a science fiction author working there, to create a replacement character. Given the interest in space, Semixon decided that instead of creating a normal human detective like Roy Raymond or Captain Compass, he would do something different. He would create a Martian detective. There was a lot of interest in Mars and aliens at the time, and a lot of ideas about what they could be like. Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles had been collected in 1950. In his stories, Martians were telepathic and were also able to change their appearance to blend in with humans. In previous decades, Edgar Rice Burroughs and the pulp era in general helped popularize the idea of Martians. He described many races of Martians, with green Martians being giant savages. In 1951, the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still came out. It was about a benevolent alien who comes to live among humans to understand them better and help them overcome their darker instincts. In 1953, the Invaders from Mars movie came out, and it was about hostile aliens controlling people's minds. In the real world, good pictures of Mars would not be available until the Mariner 4 mission in 1964, so Mars was very mysterious. Some existing pictures of Mars hinted at canals, which some people believed were proof of civilization, but in reality were optical illusions. These canals show up in the works of Bradbury and Burroughs, and they show up, albeit briefly, in the Martian Manhunter stories. In 1955, we knew a lot less about Mars, and the idea that there could be life, and even intelligent life on Mars, well, it was felt to be a possibility in popular culture. So, Joseph Semixon works with Joe Certa, who had been doing the art for Captain Compass, to create the Martian Manhunter. Now, previously, in 1953, Edmund Hamilton had created a detective from Mars called Roh'Kar, so technically the Martian Manhunter isn't the first Martian lawman in DC Comics. Do we think Semixon copied or was inspired by Roh'Kar? Not really. A Martian detective isn't a huge creative leap given the interest in Mars and the fact that you were writing detective stories. So Roh'Kar is also referred to as a Manhunter from Mars. Now at this time, Manhunter was basically slang for detective, and comics loved alliteration. Just ask Clark Kent, Lois Lane, or Lex Luthor. Anyway, Martian Manhunter, or Manhunter from Mars, sounded good, so it worked for Roh'Kar, and of course, the Martian Manhunter character this video is about. Now this was not originally intended as a superhero name, but more of a tagline. The feature was titled John Jones, Manhunter from Mars, to align with Roy Raymond, TV Detective. The first story is unsurprisingly the origin of the Martian Manhunter. In this story, a scientist named Mark Erdell creates a robot brain to explore the cosmos and probe other dimensions. Erdell says it reaches through space and time, which is an interesting detail, but which really isn't followed through on. When activated, it brings a Martian to Earth. The Martian is a green-skinned humanoid wearing a red harness and wearing a blue cape. This is where you see how Joe Certa might have been influenced by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Burroughs depicted many races of Martians, but one was the Green Martians. They were large, brutish creatures with green skin who wore harnesses instead of clothes. You see that reflected in the art for this new Martian character. He is green, has a Neanderthalish brow, and wears a harness instead of a shirt. Now, Burroughs' Green Martians are nothing like this Martian story-wise. Story-wise, this Martian more closely resembles Bradbury's Martians, an advanced race with psychic powers who can change their appearance. So you see that the influences on the writing, the art, may have come from different places. The first thing this newly arrived Martian does is use telepathy to read Erdell's mind and change his appearance to be human in order to not alarm humans, which promptly causes an incredibly alarmed Erdell to have a heart attack, even though this change is mainly just skin color and clothes. The Martian has no access to his advanced technology and is unable to save Erdell, so Erdell dies, and the Martian is trapped on Earth because he's not able to correctly operate the robot brain. Anyway, we learned that our Martian's name is John Jones. This might have been a nod to a character from an Isaac Asimov book set on Mars, but it is likely Semixon is just choosing a familiar name that is also alliterative. It is spelled with apostrophes and Z's and extra letters, but while alien how it is written, it is just the familiar name John Jones. In a purely written medium, you can play little games with language, like unpronounceable names like Mitzvitlik, which I just pronounced, or the magic incantations of Zatanna, which are just what she wants to happen, written backwards, or later on the Kryptonian font, which can be decoded into English if you have the patience. So, When they choose a name for their alien, they just choose John Jones instead of something like Zod or Sauron to play on expectations. Then they aliened up John Jones with some Z's and apostrophes. Eventually, in 2001, Bruce Timm's Justice League cartoon decided that the name is said J'onn J'onzz, partially because the show deals with him in his alien persona and almost never in his human one, and they wanted to focus on his alienness. This pronunciation caught on, and I will use it from now on because I like it. I will also use it as a convention when pronouncing other Martian names like Ta'am or Barrett. J'onn is presented as a benevolent alien from an advanced civilization that has abolished crime and war. John is a peaceful scientist who decides to help the Earthians fight against crime until his people develop space travel in their Star Ride project. For reference, this is 1955. NASA was founded in 1958, and the first person in space, Yuri Gagarin, was still 6 years off in 1961. So the idea that we would end crime and war before we got into space might not have seemed like nonsense, but, well, it didn't pan out. John wanders the Earth, and it seems clear he visits New York and France, seeing the Empire State Building, tallest building on Earth at the time, and the Arc de Triomphe. He comments on cars, skyscrapers, and wars in a very classical sci-fi way, with a viewpoint from a supposedly more advanced culture. He then uses his abilities to pull gold from seawater. This had been a thing that Germany and later Dow Chemicals had tried in the 1930s and 40s, and not succeeded in any way to make it economical. But Saxon probably imagines that this is something simple for an advanced alien. Then John decides to help Earthians by fighting crime. A couple panels later, he has joined the police force and become a detective, planning to use his Martian abilities, his Martian powers, to fight crime. So, what are these Martian powers? This ends up being a little tricky to answer for a couple reasons. One is that the style of the comic during the Silver Age is that John frequently pulls out the power he needs, like Batman would pull out a new gadget from his utility belt. New powers are cool, so having him pull out a new power is something they have him do quite a bit. Remember, role-playing games and video games and the idea of ascribing stats to comic book powers doesn't really exist at this point in history. The fact that the Martian Manhunter didn't have a regular writer also probably exacerbated this. Jack Miller and Dave Wood wrote a majority of the stories, but other authors like George Kashdan, Arnold Drake, and the Manhunter creator Joseph Semexon himself also wrote stories. Nowadays, comic companies will create character references, sometimes called character bibles, that give details about a character in order for writers across the company to keep continuity straight. But in the early 50s, Martian Manhunter was only showing up in one feature, and I suspect there were no notes about what John could or couldn't do, so authors felt free to add new powers. Note that Dave Wood was responsible for creating the Dial H for Heroes stories, where he creates new heroes and powers for every story, so creating new powers was definitely in Wood's wheelhouse. Now, eventually Jack Miller would take all the writing duties in 1958 and would write all the Martian Manhunter stories until 1968, alongside Joe Certa, who drew every Martian Manhunter story. Now, John does have a set of powers that he uses very regularly. His core set includes the ability to change shape, because he has to be able to turn into a human form. He frequently uses intangibility and invisibility. During this detective period, he is almost always invisible when not in his human disguise. His senses of sight and hearing are enormously enhanced. He can do things like see through objects, basically Superman's X-ray vision, and track vehicles based on tire tracks or exhaust molecules. One power definitely not included in this set is telepathy. This may seem a little surprising given that nowadays we often think of this character as a telepath, but during his time in the Silver Age he rarely displays this ability. He does display it in some pivotal issues. In his origin, he uses telepathy to read Erdell's mind. 2 issues later, he uses the power to read a criminal's mind in order to check an alibi. He also uses it in the Justice League comic, in the telling of their origin in Justice League of America number 9. He is able to read the mind of an Apalexian golem. But he actually seems surprised that he was able to do this, and this was primarily used as a framing device for backstory on the golems. Now, telepathy isn't the only power John displays, but then seems to stop using. For example, in his second appearance, he reveals the ability to see the future. But this is actually a power that would make it really hard to write detective stories, so after this issue, he just doesn't use it anymore. He only uses it to predict the outcome of a baseball game, because he had to use his vast alien powers to prevent the fixing of baseball games. Battling Darkseid can wait! Note that Darkseid would not be created for another 15 years. Another example is teleportation. In issue 231, he teleports, and while he uses his ability in several issues, he eventually just kind of forgets he has it. He also demonstrates that he can transmute materials to such an extent that he can duplicate objects. But he also seems to forget this power as well. Another part of the confusion is the naming of powers. The writers like to create cool-sounding power names or techno-babbly descriptions, so what John calls a power might change from issue to issue. Blasts from his eyes are called atom vision one time and space lightning another time. Telekinetic powers might be referred to as molecular hypnosis, mind over matter, bombarding with thought waves, or increasing the gravitational pull. Exactly what John can do also changes over time because the nature of the character changes over time. He starts as a science fiction, psychic detective kind of character, but drifts more and more towards being a Superman-style superhero as the genre increases in popularity. So later in the comic, John adds several additional powers to his core power set. He starts using super strength, invulnerability, and super lung power that allows him to create hurricane force winds. Flight is also kind of in there, but it feels like the writers were sometimes unsure if he could fly. Sometimes he talks about using his lung power as a jet or leaping somewhere. There are a couple weird issues where he flaps his arms or spins them like a helicopter to fly. Is the idea that he can only fly while intangible? It wasn't super clear to me. But since flight is one power he consistently uses in the future, let's call it and say he can fly. And he starts using this very Superman-like power set more and more as time goes on. For example, early John might phase through a wall, while later John might smash through it. Early John might use invisibility, while later John would move so fast he couldn't be seen, like Superman or the Flash. Early John might use telekinesis, while later John would use super breath, like Superman. Early John would drive a car to get somewhere, while later John would use flight or super speed. Also, as he builds a history and undergoes its transition, his powers tend to settle a bit and become less variable. A lot of his wilder powers showed up earlier in his secret detective period, like seeing the future, reading minds, telekinesis, and duplicating objects. The kind of stories and antagonists also changed over time. In the beginning, the stories focus more on his being a detective and are a little more mundane. Later stories would get wilder and focus more on his powers. For example, early on he might be saving and befriending a dog, solving a murder by examining clues, or tricking a criminal into confessing. Later on he might be dealing with being shrunk by a criminal, handling haywire powers, or hunting down an alien. So the focus shifts from his detective skills to his Martian powers. You also see the evolution of the stories and the kind of villains he fights. Early on, the criminals are fairly boring and generic thugs. Later on, you start to see kind of proto-supervillains. You get criminals with special gadgets, vehicles, or robots. You get some special skills like animal training, disguises, performance magic, or actual magic. You also get a few traditional villains with colorful names and special abilities. You get the Human Flame, Mr. Moth, the Getaway King, and the Falcon. I will talk about the Getaway King in a later video, and the Human Flame in a much, much later video, but these are the first kind of named, themed villains John faces. But it's important to note that they are in no way a match for John Jones. I mean, Mr. Moth is just a dude with a helicopter, a spotlight, and a moth hat. The Human Flame just has armor with a built-in flamethrower. The Falcon just has a plane with a grappling hook and a bag of feathers. And of course, a Falcon mask. These villains really aren't much of a threat to John. The villains are also all one-issue villains, so they don't really become very notable or memorable. The gradual change in the stories also creates visual changes in the arts. I mean, he does look like a superhero right off the bat with a cape, the lack of humility, and the very bold fashion choices. But in the early issues, when he is invisible, he is drawn as human. He does have a visual effect where a Martian form surrounds him when he uses his powers, but you rarely see him in his full Martian form. Around issue 240, this changes. After this, when he is invisible, he is drawn as a Martian, so he looks more superhero-y. I mean, almost no one ever sees him, so I'm talking about it from the reader's perspective. This actually brings up something I wanted to talk about. This is how I imagine a conversation going during the creation of Martian Manhunter. Okay, on this panel, draw the invisible Martian walking across the road. Draw the invisible... Yeah, draw an invisible Martian. Do you know what invisible means? Just make it happen! So Joe Certa used a combination of coloring, dash lines, and what I will call aura lines to indicate invisibility. The funny thing is that he continually changes how he does this. In my opinion, I like the dashed lines the best. They seem very mechanical and I don't know how they were done. Maybe they took too much time, I don't know. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the stories. And what they are like and what they are about. Structurally, these are 6-page stories. The first page is usually a half-page teaser panel, essentially the cover for the feature that hints at what the story is about. Now, the first issue has him compare Earth with his fictional Martian civilization, and this is a great way for a story to examine and comment on things. He comments on war, traffic, crime, and such. But this element does not go beyond the first issue. The stories are not about observations of Earth. They are very much detective stories and not science fiction stories. The stories are largely about how he uses his powers and wits to overcome criminals. And like I mentioned when I'm talking about the Silver Age, the stories don't ever span beyond a single issue. They have to tell the entire story in 6 pages, so they are very dense, so there isn't a lot of characterization of Ja'an. Beyond a few panels about him missing home or planning on returning to Mars, the stories don't really go into his feelings about being a Martian on Earth. He feels very much like a generic good guy with not much personality. Beyond Ja'an himself, there is only one reoccurring character during his time as a secret hero. It is the police chief, Captain Harding, who only really gets a name a few years into the run. He is pretty generic and mainly serves as a person to give Ja'an assignments. In terms of continuity, well, like with the consistency of his powers, it doesn't seem to be a focus, perhaps partially due to the changing authors. For example, he gets a dog who ends up saving his life and names him Jupiter, but Jupiter doesn't show up again. In issue 228, Erdell's robot brain is destroyed, but in future issues it shows up again without explanation. So there isn't a lot of continuity, and the stories have a very self-contained feel. The crime he is fighting in these stories is almost always theft, partially so they can stay within the confines of the Comics Code, which restricts crimes like kidnapping and corruption. Now, criminals are rarely a threat to Ja'an, although in the later stories, criminals do manage to do the save the endangered people or catch me trick quite a bit in order to evade him. So since his foes are always weaker than him, what is the source of the dramatic tension in these stories? Well, it generally comes from 2 places. One is trying to conceal his powers and the fact that he's a Martian living on Earth. Nobody is supposed to know that Ja'an is a Martian, so he has to hide what he can do. Like he might have to pretend to be hospitalized while sneaking out to stop criminals, or use his powers to boost another officer's confidence while remaining undetected, or save an incompetent vigilante who ends up getting credit for his actions. He is helped by the fact that he is almost always invisible. But trying to conceal his powers is often made harder despite his invisibility by having someone always around, like a photographer, the police chief's nephew, the police commissioner's daughter, or a bodyguard, who are constantly watching him and increasing the difficulty of using his powers without being detected. Or he might be undercover in some way, like impersonating the mayor. Keeping himself and his powers hidden is a repeated challenge. The other major source of dramatic tension is fire. Fire is the Martian Manhunter's weakness. When fire is nearby, he loses his powers. This is established from the first issue, and this shows up in a vast majority of the issues. It really isn't explained in any way, it's just the nature of Martians. Strangely, it also applies to Martian animals and even robots. Even when it doesn't affect the story, John will often remark on it when seeing someone smoking or something. Remember that in those days, parts of the medical community knew smoking was causing lung cancer, but it wasn't widely known in the population at large, and it wouldn't be until 1965 that cigarettes would carry warnings. So in the Silver Age, it was cool to show smoking, but not murder. But now, that's reversed. You can find murder in comics pretty easily, but it is much harder to find smokers. Anyway, the Martian Manhunter's world is full of fire. You got the smokers, you got easily knocked over oil lamps all over the place. Fire seemed to start really easily around the Martian Manhunter. Maybe it was very dry. Now, you might feel that this is an incredibly dumb weakness. You have this incredibly powerful being who is so easily taken down. As Batman says,
I have a $70,000 sliver of radioactive meteor to stop the one from Metropolis. With you, all I need is a penny for a book of matches.
But let's look at it in context. Think about writing a story about a superpowered alien who fights crime. What makes it hard? What can challenge this alien? It is easy to add fire to a story to challenge the Martian Manhunter without having his enemies have to explicitly use it against him. Sparks light leaves on fire, or the aforementioned oil lamps tip over and starts a fire. Remember, during his detective years, no one knows a Martian has come to Earth except Mark Rodell, who died very soon after finding out. Some criminals see him briefly, but they are always dismissed as delusional. No one can use the knowledge of his weakness against John. Fire also works as a weakness because it is easy to overcome. Tipping over a water tower, smashing an aquarium, crying on the flames, smothering them with liquid glass, or even just blowing it out ends the threat. It is also great later on when he joins the Justice League because he is both easily beaten and contained and easily helped or freed. But I will talk a little bit more about this when I get to his time in the Justice League. So fire is frequently used to create difficulties for John and add some dramatic tension. Some stories kind of force him towards fire, like when he has to investigate arson or act as a firefighter. However, John had other things that weakened him as well, like strange meteors, a classic, astrological events like a comet passing between Earth and Mars, and even people just messing with a robot brain that brought him to Earth. But these are pretty rare, and fire is overwhelmingly his main weakness. These other weaknesses kind of fade away and stop getting used because fire is such an easy weakness to work into a story. Beyond his secrecy and his vulnerability to fire, another thing that can challenge him is other Martians and things from his own planet. Now, there really isn't much world building in these comics, but in a handful of cases, Mars does come into play. Like I mentioned before, in his origin, John talks about how Martians have an advanced civilization that has no war or crime. Specifically, he says that Mars has had 1,000 years of peace. He also talks about a great evolution that happened centuries ago where their enlightened science made crime obsolete. He even references the Great Evolution in later issues. But 6 issues in, George Cashdan gets a right issue and he decides to add a criminal that could provide an actual challenge for John. So he creates an unnamed Martian criminal. This criminal has come to Earth because of a defective belt device which is supposed to keep him floating in space. Which, to be honest, is pretty horrific as a form of punishment. I guess you could say that maybe the Great Evolution made criminals super rare, or maybe this guy had been floating in space for centuries and predated the Great Evolution. But 5 issues later, John is actually able to communicate with his parents on Mars, and they tell him about a band of Martian criminals. This is our first real look at John's Mars. You don't get much details. But it has those canals that people thought they saw. You learn that Martians have a unit of time measurement called meters, which is confusing. You see John's mom and dad who have been worried about him, and he seems pretty close to them. That makes John seem young in contrast to future depictions that don't involve his parents. Much later in Detective Comics 287, you actually learn that John has a little brother, Tom Jones, who is kind of an irresponsible scamp. Other Martian criminals show up later, like Barrett and Burns. And Martian criminals aren't the only Martian things that plague John. A Martian robot called Tor, who accidentally got programmed to be a criminal, is able to possess a human and give him superpowers in issue 243. John is actually forced to flee from an opponent for the first time, but luckily this robot dies due to the environment of the world the Martians trapped it on. Martian weapons and dangerous Martian animals like Martian mandrills also end up on Earth and cause problems for John. So Mars is used as a source of challenges for John, but you also get to see a slice of his home life. Okay, there's a lot more to John's story, and I have a lot more to say about it. This is just the first video planned in the series, and the first video I have made. The next video will be about John's final transformation into a full-fledged superhero. If you like this content, please like and subscribe, and constructive comments are also welcome. It will encourage me to make more videos.